Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah shir. We are holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav and we'll be learning today Miras Hashem Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Beis and beginning a brand new Siman Taf Reish Lamed Ches Sukkah V'Noya Asurin Kol Shiva, the Sukkah and the materials that the Sukkah is built out of, and the Noi Sukkah, the decorations of the Sukkah, are forbidden for all other use all 7 days of Yom Tov, Ubai Beis Seifim, and here we have 2 Seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Atzei Sukkah Asurim Kol Shmoinas Yemei HaChag. The materials, the wood that the Sukkah is built out of, is forbidden not only for 7 days, not just for the 7 days of Sukkot, but for all 8 days. The Mechaber is speaking here about an ideal situation in Eretz Yisrael, where we have 7 days of Sukkot followed by 1 day of Shmini Atzeres, and the Mechaber tells us that the materials of the Sukkah would be forbidden for use all 7 days of Sukkot, and on the 8th day as well, the day of Shmini Atzeres as well. And the Mishnah Berurah says this applies bein atzei defanois, both to the wood, the materials that the walls are made out of, bein atzei schach, and also equally to the wood, the material that the schach is comprised of. And the Ramah puts in here in parentheses, va'afilu kisem lachtzois b'shinav Aser, he brings down from the Maharil, it would even be forbidden to break off a simple splinter of wood, to use it as a toothpick. Even such a minor form of deriving hana from the sukkah, that would be aser. Now we'll see a little bit further precisely what kinds of hana'os are forbidden and what kinds are permissible. We'll get into that a little bit more. But first, let's go to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph, and let's see why it is that the materials of the sukkah, the materials of the schach, are aser. What is this iser based on? Says the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph Atzei Sukkah. Very interesting reason that you wouldn't have thought of unless you learned it in the Gemara. If you learned Daf Yomi, so recently you learned this in Masechta Sukkah. I believe it's on Daf Tes Amud Aleph. It's in the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. The Mishnah Berurah brings down here the Ksiv because the pasuk writes Chag Hasukas Shivas Yamim Lashem. The pasuk says Chag Hasukas. You should make a Chag. You make a Yom Tov of Sukkos. Shivas Yamim, 7 days. Lashem, for Hashem. And the Gemara darshans Kishem Shachal Shem Shamayim Al HaChagiga. The pasuk says Chag. Now we translate Chag as the Yom Tov, but we know that on Yom Tov, we go to the Beis Hamikdash and we bring karbanos. One of the karbanos that we bring are the Shalmei Chagiga. We bring a shlamim l'chvayid Yom Tov. We bring a carbon shlamim. Now we know that when you bring a carbon, you're magdish the behema l'shamayim. You make it kadosh, you set it aside for use as a carbon. Once you're magdish that behema, you're not allowed to use it for anything else. If you would use it for anything else, that would be an iser of mi'ila. So once you're magdish the behema, the shalmei chagiga, the carbon shlamim lashem, it gets kedusha, you're not allowed to use it for anything else. Says Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, this pasuk is makish the shalmei chagiga and the sukkah together by writing Chag Hasukkah Shivas Yamim La Hashem. What the pasuk is telling me is like the Mishnah Berurah says over here, Keshem Shechal Shem Shamayim Ala Chagiga. The same way the Shem Shamayim, the kedusha, the fact that it's La Hashem, is chal on the carbon, and therefore there's an issur me'ilah. You're not allowed to use it for anything else. Kach chal Shem Shamayim Al Hasukkah. So too the Shem Shamayim, the kedusha of the mitzvah, is chal on the sukkah, and you're not allowed to use the sukkah for anything else. From this Mishnah Berurah, the Mishnah Berurah is bringing down the Gemara over here in Sukkah, which very strongly implies that this Isser is actually an Isser Daraisa. There's an Isser Daraisa to take anything from the schach or from the walls of the Sukkah and use it for anything else in any other way. And furthermore, the Mishnah Berurah tells us, Va'afilu asa sukkah acheres b'chol hamoed. Let's say you made one sukkah for the first days of Yom Tov, and then you knew you're going away. You have a different sukkah for Chol Hamoed and for the rest of Yom Tov. So once the first 2 days of Yom Tov are over, you don't need this sukkah anymore. You might think that now I'm not using that sukkah for the mitzvah anymore. Maybe this kedusha, maybe this iser goes off. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. Va'afilu asa sukkah acheres b'chol hamoed. Even if you made a different sukkah for use during Chalamayit, and you no longer need the first sukkah for the mitzvah. Still in all, it doesn't matter. The materials of the sukkah, the materials of the schach remain aser. So again, what the Mishnah Berurah is telling me over here is this iser that the Mechaber introduces to me here in the beginning of Sif Aleph, that there's an Isser Hana, you're not allowed to use the materials of the Sukkah for anything else. What is it based on? It's based on the concept of Hoyel v'iskatsoy mitzvah. We have a muktzah machmas mitzvah. When you're miyached something for use as a mitzvah, now you're not allowed to use it for anything else. And that's what's happening over here with this sukkah. You are miyached the sukkah for mitzvah use. Now it gets this kedusha. It has this kedusha, and you're not allowed to use it for anything else. You might have thought that, well, if I don't need the sukkah anymore, it's true that I was miyached this sukkah for the mitzvah of sukkah, but that was only for the first day of Yom Tov. I don't need it for Chalamayit. For Chalamayit, I have another one. Maybe now the kedusha goes off. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no. That kedusha remains for the entire Yom Tov. That kedusha was there at the outset of Yom Tov, ben hashmashos at the beginning of Yom Tov. That kedusha remains in place as long as that sukkah is it's usable still for the mitzvah. So that kedusha remains in place, and you're not allowed to use it for anything else. Now, before we go to Ois Cotton Bays in the Mishnah Berurah, I want to go further in the Mechaber, because without going further in the Mechaber, we won't be able to properly understand Ois Cotton Bays. So again, I'm just going to read from the beginning of the Mechaber. I'd say Sukkah Asurim Kol Shmoinas Yemei Achag. I just want to point out, the Mechaber says not only is the Sukkah forbidden for use on the 7 days of Sukkot, it's also forbidden for use on Shmini Atzeres. And we're going to have to see why. And the Mechaber said, Bein Atzei Defanois, Bein Atzei Schach. This applies to the materials of the walls as well as to the materials of the schach. Even to pull a toothpick and use a piece of wood as a toothpick is forbidden. Continues the Mechaber. You cannot derive benefit from the materials of the walls or the materials of the schach for anything else. Kol Shmoinas Hayomim, all 8 days. Why 8? Explains the Mechaber, Mipnei sheyoim hashvi kuloi hasukkah muktzah ad bein hashmashos. This muktzah, this fact that the sukkah was set aside for the mitzvah of sukkah, applies all 7 days. Not only does it apply all 7 days, it even applies during the time period of bein hashmashos at the end of the 7th day of Sukkot, going into the 8th day, going into Shmini Atzeres. Because we know that when we hit Bein Hashmashos, it's a Safek Yom, Safek Laila. So if it's Bein Hashmashos at the end of the 7th day of Sukkot, going into the 8th day, there's still a Safek Yom. Maybe at that point in time, it's still Sukkot. If it's still Sukkot, then technically you still need a Sukkah. So the Muktzah status that this Sukkah has, because you are meyached it for the mitzvah, and therefore it has this kedusha that the Mishnah Berurah told me about, that applies even during Ben Hashmashos, going from the 7th day into the 8th day. Oh, says the Mechaber, if it applies during Ben Hashmashos, then continues the Mechaber, v'hoyel v'huktzah lebein Hashmashos shel shvi, since it had this muktzah status during the time period of Ben Hashmashos at the end of the 7th day going into the 8th day, huktzah l'chal hayom. Now it retains that muktzah status for the entire day 8, which is Shmini Atzeres. And if you look at the Bir Agoyla here on the side of the page, Pirish Hashmini, it's muktzah, it retains that muktzah status for the entire 8th day. Now let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Bays. The Mishnah Berurah says Shmoinas. The Mishnah Berurah focuses on what the Mechaber said. The Mechaber said that the Isser that we're speaking about over here applies for 8 days. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ula Didan, but by us here in Chutz La'aretz, Gam B'chi, it's also going to be Usser on the 9th day, on Simchas Torah. It brings this down from the Chai Adam, and the rationale is really the same kind of rationale. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Shaharei B'shmoina Adayin Mechuyev Lechel B'sukkah. On the 8th day, on Shmini Atzeres, here in Chutz La'aretz, we still have a Chiyuv to eat in the Sukkah. Why? Because Shmini Atzeres is Sveika de Yoma. Maybe it's not day 8. maybe it's day 7. So since we have this Sveika Diyona, Minig Aviseinu Biyadenu, where we still have to eat in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, so then we still need the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. It's still hooked to the mitzvah. It's still set aside for the mitzvah of Sukkah. The Kevin de Iskatsoi Ben Hashmashas, now that status of that it's Iskatsoi Mitzvah that we needed for the mitzvah of Sukkah and Shmini Atzeres, it applies all the way through Ben Hashmashas, going from day 8 into day 9. Ben Hashmashas going from Simchas Torah, from Shmini Atzeres into Simchas Torah. So then V'kevin dis Katzoi Ben Hashmashas on day 8 going into day 9 is Katzoi L'Kula Yuma. It retains that Muktzah status for the entire day 9 for Shmini Atzeres, for Simchas Torah as well. Not only that, says the Chavetz Chaim, for Mechal Shabbos Achar Yom Tov, let's say Simchas Torah is on Erev Shabbos, so you have a Shabbos following the Yom Tov. The Hagin, the minig is Shaloi Lehistapek Mimenu Gam B'Shabbos, that we don't derive Hana from the materials of the Sukkah even on Shabbos, to have a Kemeichen Mi Yom Tov L'Shabbos, because the fact that the Sukkah was forbidden in Hana on Simchas Torah, and now it becomes mutter in Hana on Shabbos at the end of Simchas Torah, that is as if Simchas Torah was meichin for Shabbos. Because on Simchas Torah, you were not allowed to be nene from the materials of the Sukkah. Now on Shabbos, suddenly you can theoretically be nene from the materials of the Sukkah. That is a little bit of a hachana, and we know that Yom Tov is not allowed to be meichin for Shabbos. So therefore, we have a minig over here, not to be nene even on Shabbos after Yom Tov. Sorry about that. There was some strange noise outside. It sounded almost like there was a crash outside. Wanted to see what was going on. I don't see anything. Okay. Ice Cotton Gimel in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber said that this Isser, this prohibition, applies Bein Atzei Defanois. It applies equally to the materials of the walls and to the materials of the schach. Now, the Mishnah Berurah tells us a very, very interesting thing here. And what I love about this Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Gimel, is this is a classic case of a Mishnah Berurah where you could just read through this Mishnah Berurah and not chap what he's truly saying. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Ve'ein nafkamina. Says the Chavetz Chaim, in the context of this halacha, this prohibition to be nene from the materials of the sukkah, there's no nafkamina bein sukkah chadasha ubein yeshana, whether the sukkah is a sukkah chadasha, a new sukkah, ubein yeshana, or if it's an old sukkah. Now, what is a new sukkah? What constitutes a new sukkah, and what constitutes an old sukkah in the context of halacha? So if you remember, back in Siman Tov Reish Lamed Vav, Daf Kuf Amud Aleph, we learned the halacha of a sukkah yeshana. What's a sukkah yeshana? A sukkah yeshana is a sukkah that you made more than 30 days prior to Yom Tov. That's called a sukkah yeshana. What's the significance of a sukkah yeshana? The significance is that when you make a sukkah within 30 days of Yom Tov, the assumption is that you built that sukkah l'shem achag. If you make a sukkah more than 30 days prior to Yom Tov, then we don't have such an assumption. If you made it more than 30 days before Yom Tov, maybe your mind wasn't on sukkah and you didn't make it l'shem achag. Now, we learned in Siman Tov Reish Lamed Vav that there is no requirement for the sukkah to be made l'shem achag. The only requirement is that the sukkah be made l'shem tseil. The sukkah has to be erected and put up l'shem tseil, as a shelter for protection from the sun, for protection from the elements. As long as a sukkah is put up l'shem tseil, it's kosher for the mitzvah of sukkah. We had a nafkamina between a sukkah that's made l'shem chag and a sukkah that's made l'shem tseil. If you make a sukkah l'shem chag, then even if you make it 90 days before Yom Tov, you could use it on Yom Tov without a problem. If you make a sukkah l'shem tseil, but not l'shem achag, if you make it 90 days before Yom Tov, then before Yom Tov you're supposed to be mechadish badavar. You're supposed to throw some fresh schach on top of the sukkah, an area of a tefach by a tefach. That was for gzeira purposes. We were afraid if we allow you to use a sukkah that you made l'shem tseil, that you didn't make l'shem achag, you might come to use a sukkah that you made l'shem bayis. and a sukkah that's made l'shem bayis would be a psul midaraisa. So there you have an afkamina between a sukkah that's made l'shem chag and a sukkah that's made l'shem tseil. But again, the sukkah chadasha is a sukkah that's made within 30 days. The assumption is it was made l'shem chag. The sukkah yeshana is a sukkah that's made more than 30 days before Yom Tov, and then there is no such assumption that it was made l'shem chag. Says the Mishnah Berurah over here, in the context of this halacha of being nene from the sukkah, ein nafkamina bein sukkah chadasha ubein yeshana. This halacha applies equally to the sukkah chadasha and the sukkah yeshana, kol shesichechua l'shem chag, as long as you put on the schach l'shem chag. So the Mishnah Berurah is telling me over here, if you made the sukkah 90 days before Yom Tov and you put on the schach l'shem chag, then this halacha applies, and this sukkah is aser ba'ana. You're not allowed to use the materials of the sukkah for anything else over the duration of Yom Tov. But if the sukkah was put up more than 30 days before Yom Tov and it was not put up l'shem chag, let's say you put up the sukkah 90 days before Yom Tov and you put it up l'shem tseil, you didn't put it up l'shem chag, then this halacha does not apply. I will explain why in a minute, but let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. Kol shesichechua l'shem chag. This halacha applies equally to the sukkah chadasha and the sukkah yeshana if it was put up l'shem chag. Aval hayoyshe besukas royim uburgenin v'kayotzin. But if somebody used a sukkah on Yom Tov, it was a sukkah royim. This was a shelter that was put up for the shepherds. It wasn't put up l'shem chag, but it's kosher. It meets all the requirements of sukkah. It's zayin al zayin. It's 10 tvachim tall. The schach is not mekabel tuma, and you put it up l'shem tseil. It was put it up as a shelter. And now you chanced upon it on Yom Tov, and you sat in it to eat lunch. You were on a chalamoid trip, and you remembered, oh, I have this sukkah's royim over here in the field. So you went in and you ate a tuna fish sandwich in that sukkah's royim. But it was never put up l'shem chag. It was only put up l'shem tseil. Uborganin, or it was a booth that was erected again l'shem tseil as a booth for a watchman, the kayotzin, or for the people who dry the fruits in the fields. Harehi kesukkah da'alma. This doesn't have this halacha of the kedusha of mitzvah, where now you're not allowed to go ahead and be nana from it. Shebishvil shenichnas zeh va'oicha pitoi lo niskatsha. This halacha of the kedusha, what did we say in Ois Katan Aleph? We said in Ois Katan Aleph that this halacha is based on the pasuk that there's a kedusha that's chal on the cheftzah shel mitzvah of the sukkah, the same way you have a kedusha that's chal on a carbon, there's a kedusha that's chal on the sukkah. But that's a sukkah that's made l'shem mitzvah. That's a sukkah that you were miyached before Yom Tov l'shem mitzvah. It got a kedusha ben hashmashos at the beginning of Yom Tov, and that kedusha remains with it for the entire Yom Tov. That's not true by the sukkah shel royim. The sukkah shel royim was never made. It was never sanctified l'shem mitzvah. So it never got that kedusha. Now, punkt, on the second day of Chol Hamoed, you walked in and you ate a tuna fish sandwich inside that sukkah. That does not invest it with the kedusha that we're speaking about over here, especially not to the extent that it'll be usher for the rest of Yom Tov. So it didn't have that kedusha when Ben Hashmashos came at the beginning of Yom Tov. When Ben Hashmashos came at the beginning of Yom Tov, it was a sukkah's royim. Nobody intended to use it as a sukkah. It wasn't built l'shem achag. Punkt. You found it on the second day of Chol Hamoed. You needed a place to eat your tuna fish sandwich. You realized it meets all the criteria. You ate a tuna fish sandwich there. But that does not invest it with this kedusha, and now we don't have that isser that you can't go ahead and use it for anything else. I think it would be very easy to read this Mishnah Berurah and not chap exactly what's going on over here. Okay, Ois Katan Daled. The phraseology of the Mechaber said in the second line of the Shulchan Aruch, in the middle of the line, Ve'ein na'oisin mehen l'davar acher. We cannot use the sukkah for anything else. We can't use the materials of the sukkah for anything else. And the Ramah had given us an example. The Ramah said you can't even pull out a splinter of wood and use it as a toothpick. That's how far this Isser goes. But the question over here is, what exactly can you do and what exactly can't you do? Are you allowed to lean on the walls of the sukkah? Is that a problem that we're going to say you're being naneh from the sukkah? Is the sukkah mamish aser b'hana? So let's take a look here what the Mishnah Berurah says in Ois Katan Dalet. Ein oisin hainu derech bittel. What that means is in a manner shebazet tibatel kedushasa. What does it mean you're not allowed to use it? You're not allowed to use it if you're going to take the kedusha of sukkah off of it. What does that mean? Well, it means like the Ramah said. You can't pull a splinter of wood off the sukkah and use it as a toothpick. Now that you pulled the splinter of wood off of the sukkah, it's not sukkah anymore. And now you're being mavatal the kedusha from it. That's what you're not allowed to do. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, but as long as the sukkah remains intact, as long as the sukkah remains a sukkah, ain't iser hana mimena, there isn't mamish an iser hana on the sukkah that you're not allowed to derive any benefit from it. And this is very interesting. It could be a topic of discussion for another time. It is interesting. We said in Ois Katan Aleph that this is based on the hekesh between Shalom and Chagiga, between a carbon and a sukkah. The truth is that by a carbon, it's aser b'hana. You're not even allowed to lean on it. It's not only that you're not allowed to do something that in some way is mevatel, you're not allowed to get any hana from a carbon at all without applying that level of isser over here, interestingly enough. But that's what the Mishnah Berurah says. He says, to lean on the sukkah, or you want to put something on top of the sukkah, you have to put something down. You're allowed to do that. Because by doing that, you're not being mevatel kedusha. Says the Mishnah Berurah that's okay. Okay. Now we go to the Ramah, 2 lines off the bottom. Says the Ramah Hagah, Va'afilu nafla hasukkah asurim. Even if the sukkah collapses. You might think, if the sukkah collapses, so now I guess the kedusha is gone. It's not a sukkah anymore. Now all it is a pile of wood. I guess there's no kedusha anymore. Says the Ramah, no. Va'afilu nafla hasukkah. It's still aser. Interesting Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in hay. Va'afilu nafla hasukkah. Hainu, what the Ramah is telling you over here is, da'afilu la poiskim. Disavri dimin HaTorah eina asura ela ba'oida kayemes. Even according to those poskim, and this is a that comes from a Taisus in Beya, even according to those Rishonim and those poskim who say that this Isser that we've been speaking about over here, this hekesh to the Shalmei Chagiga, this Isser Daraisa, only applies when the sukkah is standing and it's still a sukkah that's going to be used for the mitzvah. Midrabanan miya asa lehanis mimena mitam muktzah. But midrabanan, there's still another problem. Midrabanan, there's still an isser of muktzah. There's katzoi beben hashmasha shel tchilas hachag. This sukkah became aser for any other use at ben hashmashas at the beginning of Yom Tov. At the beginning of Yom Tov at ben hashmashas, this sukkah was a sukkah, and it's huktzah limitzvasai. It's set aside for its mitzvah use, and you're not allowed to use it for anything else. So at Ben Hashmashas, at the beginning of Yom Tov, was this sukkah usable for any other purpose? No, it was not. So then the concept of Hoylvis Katsoy Ben Hashmashas is Katsoy Kula Yuma tells me that it remains also for the rest of Yom Tov. Now that's true even if it collapses, because even if it collapses, the material of this sukkah, you want to tell me that the Isser Torah of the fact that it was a sukkah shel mitzvah, the hekesh to the Shalmei Chagiga, you want to tell me that goes off once the sukkah collapses? Maybe that goes off once the sukkah collapses. But the Isser Muktzah, what we generally call Muktzah, the opposite of Muchan, the fact that these materials were not available for use by Ben Hashmashas at the beginning of Yom Tov, and therefore it remains Muktzah for the rest of Yom Tov, that's true even when it collapses. So that's why the Mechaber says, and the Mishnah Berurah explains, Hainu da'afilu la paisku desavi dimin HaTorah en asur l'bedi kayemes midirabanan mi asa lehanis mimena mitam muktzah diskatzoi ben hashmashos shel tilas hachag. Okay, next halacha that the Ramah tells me. 2 lines off the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch by the Ois Katan Vav for the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Rambam, V'loi mahani ba t'nai. You cannot not make a t'nai. You see, we're going to see in Sif Beis that when it comes to the noise sukkah, when it comes to the decorations of the sukkah, you could make a t'nai before Yom Tov, and if you make a t'nai, a condition, before Yom Tov, then the noise sukkah does not remain aser all of sukkahs. And we're going to talk about exactly what the t'nai has to be, what the precise language of the t'nai, of the condition, has to be. But in essence, what we're going to come out is, we're going to say that when you put up the sukkah, you're going to say, any badal mima, I'm not separating myself. Again, muktzah is the opposite of muchan. Muchan means it's prepared for use. Muktzah means you're separated from it. It is designated. It's set aside for something else. If you make a t'nai on the noise sukkah and you say, I'm not designating this noise sukkah as being separated from use. No, if I want to use it, I'm allowing myself the option of using it for something else. By noise sukkah, that works. Says the Ramah, it does not work by the materials of the sukkah. V'loi mahani ba t'nai. You cannot make a t'nai on the materials of the sukkah. The materials of the sukkah remain aser for the entire Yom Tov, whether you make a t'nai or you don't make a t'nai. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he's cutting vav v'loi mahani ba t'nai. Afim mamar any beidel kol bein hashmashas. Even if you're going to turn around and you're going to say that I'm not separating myself from the materials of the sukkah for the time period of bein hashmashas, and therefore the concept of a hoil is katsoil ben hashmashas is katsoil chula yuma, or for the whole Yom Tov, should not apply, because I made it today. I didn't separate myself from the materials of the sukkah, and therefore it's not muktzah. No, that doesn't work. You know why it doesn't work? Says the Mishnah Berurah. Very interesting. Now again, let's just analyze what this person is trying to say. We have said over here that the materials of the sukkah are aser because hoil v'huktzah l'mitzvasai. They've been, you were miyached them for the mitzvah of sukkah, and therefore they got this kedusha. Well, what if I say I'm not being miyached for the mitzvah of sukkah? I put up the sukkah. You're telling me that it gets this kedusha because I'm miyached it for the mitzvah. I'm not being miyached it for the mitzvah. I'm leaving myself open. I'm reserving the option that, you see that panel over there, that wood panel? I see that there's some loose splinters of wood over there. I want to have the option to pull off a splinter and use it as a toothpick. So, no, I'm not miyached the sukkah in its entirety for the mitzvah of sukkah. I want to leave myself the option of using it for something else. Says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Ramah, it doesn't work. Explains the Mishnah Berurah why not. Kevan di efshel lital ben hashmashos mishum de kasasar ahaloi. Because the truth is that during the time period of ben hashmashos, there's another reason why you can't derive any other kind of benefit from the sukkah. And that is that you're not allowed to take off a piece of the sukkah because of the isser of stira. There's a malacha of stira, baina and seiser. There's one of the lamates malachas. So there's another reason why you can't break off a piece of the sukkah, and that is seiser. Oh, okay. So now, what is the t'nai that you tried to make? The t'nai that you tried to make was, don't tell me that this sukkah is miyuchid for the mitzvah. No, I want to have the option of using it for something else. But you don't have the option of using it for something else. Because during Ben Hashmashas, you can't pull off a piece of the sukkah. If you can't pull off a piece of the sukkah during Ben Hashmashas at the beginning of Yom Tov, then you can't pull off a piece of the sukkah for the rest of Yom Tov. If you can't pull off a piece of the sukkah, so then you can't use it for anything else. If you can't use it for anything else, then it is miyuchid for the mitzvah. If it is miyuchid for the mitzvah, then it has this kedusha, and then this isser applies. So afim mamar any beidel mimenu kol Ben Hashmashas, even if you'll try to make that tonight, since you can't take a piece off of the sukkah because of the malacha of seiser, so it remains muksa for the rest of Yom Tov, all 7 days. But that's not true by noise sukkah in Sif Beis. By noise sukkah in Sif Beis, you don't have an issur stira. There's no malacha of stira. You're not being over the malacha of stira by taking down a piece of noise sukkah. So by noise sukkah, you don't have an Isser of Stira, so you can make a Tanai at the beginning of Yom Tov. I'm not separating myself from the Noi Sukkah. I want to leave myself the option. If I want to be able to use this piece of Noi Sukkah for something else other than Noi Sukkah, I'm retaining that option. And therefore, it's not Muktzah for the rest of Yom Tov. V'dan, you should know, says the Chavetz Chaim. The Hod the Mashma Mistimas Ramah, the Loi Mahani Tanai B'Shum Gavna. The way the Ramah wrote this, it seems, the Ramah just said flat out that a Tanai is not effective. The implication of the Ramah is that a Tanai is not effective, Afilu Naflu. The same way we saw that this prohibition applies even after the Sukkah collapses. So it seems when the Ramah says that a Tanai doesn't work, a Tanai also is not efficacious even if the Sukkah collapses. Says the Chavetz Chaim, that's true to a point. Hainu dafka b'shivas hayamim. That's only true during the first 7 days of Yom Tov. Aval b'shmini shaloi. But once you hit Shmini Atzeres, the Isurei hu rak mishum muktzah, at that point we explained, the only reason this prohibition remains in effect on Shmini Atzeres is because since you needed the Sukkah on day 7, because day 7 you still have a mitzvah Sukkah, so you needed the Sukkah on day 7, all the way through Ben Hashmashas going into Shmini Atzeres. So okay, it had the Muktzah status during Shmini Atzeres, during Ben Hashmashas, it retains it for the whole Shmini Atzeres. That's the only reason the Sukkah is also to you on Shmini Atzeres. Mahani Tanai l'kishayiplu sheyachal l'hishtamish ben. If the Sukkah collapses before Shmini Atzeres, then a Tanai is efficacious. See, the Tanai can't be effective during the first 7 days, because during the first 7 days, what's the Tanai going to do? At Ben Hashmashas going into Yom Tov, the Sukkah was standing, and the Sukkah was miyuchid for the mitzvah. So it remains miyuchid for the mitzvah for the rest of Yom Tov. And your Tanai doesn't help. You can't remove the Kedusha based on the Tanai. And we have Rashi's problem brought down earlier in this Mishnah Berurah of the fact that you can't pull anything off of the Sukkah because of the Isser of Stira. So a Tanai isn't going to help you during the first 7 days. But as far as the Isser of Muktzah that landed on these materials, Ben Hashmashas, going into day 8, there is no Kedusha of the mitzvah left anymore, because you're not using this Sukkah for the mitzvah anymore. The Sukkah collapsed before Ben Hashmashas of day 7 going into day 8. So the Kedusha of the mitzvah is not there anymore. So you can't say that the reason the Sukkah should be Aser continuing on day 8 is somehow because you needed it during Ben Hashmashas from 7 to 8. No, you didn't. It wasn't usable. It wasn't usable for the mitzvah. Okay. Now, bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch Kaf Aleph Amud Beis, the Ramah says, "Aval eitzim hasmuchim lo sukkah." However, when it comes to wood that you might have stacked up next to the walls of the sukkah, but they're not connected to the sukkah, so they're not bottled to the sukkah, mutarim, those don't get any kedusha and those remain mutter. You could use that wood for other permissible purposes on Yom Tov, and we even learned about this in Hilchas Yom Tov, where we said that wood, you would be able to use it for havara, you would be able to use it to make a fire, to cook on Yom Tov. Vayin le'el siman tavkov yud ches siv ches in Hilchas Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton Zion, aval eitzam asmuchim ay le'el b'siv tavkov yud ches, be Mishnah Berurah siv cotton lamed tesham, be yarnu kol prate din zeh. And again, this is a reference to wood that you stacked around the walls of the sukkah, but you did not connect them to the walls of the sukkah in any way. Therefore, they're not bottled to the sukkah. So in the context of Hilchas Yom Tov, we weren't talking about a sukkah shel mitzvah. You have a shed. Now, on Yom Tov, you want to break off a piece of the wall of the shed and use it for havara? You can't do that. That's muktzah. It's not set aside for use for havara on Yom Tov. It's the wall of a shed. But wood that you stacked alongside the walls, that you're allowed to use. We don't say it becomes bottled to the shed. Same too in the context, same thing here, in the context of the halacha that we're learning here in Hilchas Sukkah, the Ramah is telling me the wood of the walls of the sukkah have kedusha, but the wood that you stack next to the walls does not become bottled to the sukkah, and that does not have kedusha. What the Ramah wants to say is the Shamuvur Ba'agah. Over there, the Ramah explains the Imzar Chavilois Alaschach. If you threw bundles of wood or something on top of your schach, they don't become bottled to the schach. When it comes to a sukkah of mitzvah also, if you built a sukkah before Yom Tov and you put up an adequate amount of schach and you have a kosher sukkah, and now on Yom Tov you threw some bundles of schach up on top, not because you wanted for the sukkah, just you needed a place to put it, it doesn't become bottled to the sukkah, it doesn't get the kedusha of sukkah, and it doesn't become aser b'hana. Vayin sham Mishnah Berurah. Okay, let's just finish up over here the last few words of the Shulchan Aruch and Kuf Aleph of Beis. Ve'em achar she'asa hashir hatzorich bin hadafanos. Let's say you were putting up a sukkah, and you learned Dirshu Mishnah Berurah, so you learned all of the halachas of the walls of the sukkah, and you know that you could get away with two perpendicular walls as long as they're zayin al zayin, and then you need a tefach, you need a little piece of wood within 3 tvachim of the corner, and then you need a tzuras ha-pesach. So you went ahead and you made a sukkah, and you made all the minimal requirements of a sukkah, and that is your sukkah shel mitzvah. Then on Yom Tov you decided to add another wall because you wanted privacy or you wanted some protection from the sun. So you decided to add another wall. In that case, says the Mechaber, if after you made sufficient walls so that you should have a kosher sukkah, v'nishlam hechsher sukkah, so that you completed what you need for a kosher sukkah, haisiv doifen, then you decided to add a wall, loy mitzvah. That new wall that you added does not get this kedusha of mitzvah, so that now it should be aser b'hana. No, the walls that you made l'shem mitzvah, those get this kedusha. But the additional wall that you added on later for privacy, that doesn't get the kedusha. Again, this is similar to what we learned earlier in the shir in Ois Katan Gimel. The sukkah that you built l'shem mitzvah, the l'shem achag, that gets kedusha and it carries an iser. But the sukkah shel burgenin, the watchman's hut that you happen to eat a tuna fish sandwich in, that doesn't get kedusha. So too over here, this additional wall that you added later, it doesn't suddenly get kedusha by virtue of the fact that it happens to be connected to a sukkah. The part that gets kedusha is the part that you put up l'shem mitzvah sukkah. That's what you were miyached l'shem mitzvah. That gets the kedusha similar to the shalmi chagiga. That carries an iser b'hana. But this extra wall, like mitzvah, that doesn't get an iser. Avol, however, don't think this means that you could go to your sukkah and in middle of sukkahs you could strip your sukkah bare down to the bare minimums of hechsher sukkah and use the rest of it for firewood. No. If you went out before sukkahs and you put up your 4-walled sukkah and you did it stam, you didn't say, okay, this wall is part of the sukkah, this wall is part of the sukkah, this tefach is part of the sukkah. No, you just put up all 4 walls. If you did that stam, kulan asurais umuktzais, then the entire sukkah carries this iser because you put up all 4 walls of Shem Chag. You created all of it as a chefza shel mitzvah. It's all a sukkah. So then it all carries the iser. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue with Hashem with this from tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schluss of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Hashem should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnasa to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Kel Tzedek B'meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.